The West was a land of second chances, or so they said. For a woman like Eliza, a widow with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few meager coins, it felt more like a last resort. The promise of a new life, a job as a baker for a solitary rancher, was the only thing pulling her forward, mile after agonizing mile. The memory of her husband, lost to a fever that had swept through their small town, was a weight she carried with her, a shadow in the relentless sun. She had left behind everything she knew, a world of familiar faces and a life that had been simple if not prosperous. Now, a new landscape unfolded before her, one of endless plains, jagged rock formations, and the kind of silence that made a person feel truly alone. She had heard stories of the ranches, of men as tough as the land they worked, and she prayed the one who hired her was a man of his word. The letter was brief, the handwriting a man's rough scrawl. Need a baker. Pay is fair. Supplies provided. Come to the Bar M Ranch. The name signed was simply Jake. No last name, no niceties. Just an offer of work. It was all she needed. As the ranch came into view, a sense of relief washed over her, quickly followed by a pang of apprehension. This was it. The place where her future would begin, for better or worse. The wagon's squeaking slowed to a halt in front of the main house. She dismounted, her dress now caked with a fine layer of dust. A man emerged from the barn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to hold a permanent shadow of sadness. His movements were purposeful, his jaw set. This was Jake. "You're late," he said. Eliza flinched slightly at his blunt tone. "The road was difficult, sir, my apologies." Jake simply nodded, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her plain dress and her weary but proud posture. "Get your things. The kitchen is in the house. Your room is above it." He turned and walked back towards the barn without another word. Eliza watched him go, a sense of deflation settling over her. This was not the welcome she had imagined. She had expected a handshake, a brief introduction, perhaps even a moment of human kindness. Instead, she was met with a cold indifference that felt as vast as the land itself. She had to remind herself that she was here to work, not to make friends. She was here to survive. She lifted her small trunk from the back of the wagon. It was heavy and she stumbled slightly. As she did, the front door of the house opened a crack. A small face, pale and thin, peeked out. It was Lily, no older than 6, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The door quickly closed again. A brief, fleeting glimpse. A child's face etched with a sadness that felt so familiar. In that moment, something shifted inside Eliza. Her focus, which had been solely on her own survival, now included a silent, unspoken question. What had this land done to this family? Eliza carried her trunk into the house. The interior was spacious but sparse. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, but no fire burned in it. The kitchen was large, with a massive wood-fired oven and a long, worn table. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the windows. The house felt less like a home and more like a tomb. It was clean, but devoid of any warmth. No pictures on the walls, no personal trinkets on the shelves. It was a place where people existed, but did not truly live. Eliza walked over to the oven, running her hand over the cool iron surface. She imagined the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air, the warmth spreading through the room. She had a job to do, to bake, to bring life in the form of bread to this silent house. But as she looked around, she knew her task was bigger than just kneading dough and tending to a fire. It was about bringing warmth, and perhaps a flicker of light, back into this desolate place. She turned towards the door to the other part of the house, a thoughtful look on her face. She heard the faint sound of a child's cough from a room nearby. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. This was a challenge she was ready for. The first few days were a study in silent routine. Eliza worked from dawn until dusk. She baked bread, rolls, and simple cakes. She mended torn linens and swept floors. Jake would come in, collect his food, and leave without a word, his face a mask of stone. Lily, the little girl, remained a ghost. Eliza quickly realized the child rarely ate. Plates of food she would leave out for her were often left to grow cold. She saw the girl in glimpses, a fleeting shadow in a hallway, the soft sound of a footfall upstairs. Lily was a presence in the house, but not a person. She was a silent, living echo of the grief that had settled over the ranch. Eliza was cleaning the fireplace one afternoon, humming a low, simple tune. The humming was quiet, but it was the first sound of music the house had heard in a long time. Suddenly, a small white mouse scampered out from a crevice and across the floor. Eliza stopped humming and watched it, a small smile on her face. "Well, hello there, little one," she whispered. "You're a long way from the fields." She made a soft, cooing sound. The mouse froze for a moment before darting behind a large flour sack. As she straightened up, she saw Lily standing in the doorway, her head tilted slightly, watching her. The girl's eyes were fixed on the spot where the mouse disappeared. It was the first time Lily had shown any interest in her. Eliza remained still, her hands resting on the broom handle, not wanting to scare the child away. The little girl simply watched for a long moment, a flicker of something almost like curiosity in her sad eyes. Then, just as silently as she had appeared, she turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the hallway. Eliza's heart ached for her. She was not here to be a mother or a friend, but the sight of that small, forlorn child stirred a compassion she couldn't ignore. The next morning, as she began her baking, she had an idea. She set aside a small piece of dough, shaping it into the form of a tiny mouse. She placed 2 small currants for eyes and baked it until it was a light, golden brown. After it had cooled, she left it on a plate on the long kitchen table, right next to a warm slice of fresh bread and a small glass of milk. Later that afternoon, she was upstairs in her room, mending a tear in one of her dresses, when she heard the softest sound from below, a tiny, almost inaudible scraping. She crept to the top of the stairs and peered down. Lily was standing on a stool, her small hand reaching out for the bread mouse. She picked it up carefully, examining it with a seriousness that seemed too old for her. She then bit into the bread mouse, her expression remaining blank, but her hand stayed on the plate. Eliza's heart swelled. It was a small, fragile victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The next day, she made a bread bird. The day after, a tiny bread flower. Each time, Lily would appear silently, take the offering and vanish. It was their own secret language, a wordless conversation between the quiet baker and the silent child. Jake, however, remained oblivious to the small changes. He was a man consumed by his work, and the ranch was a demanding master. One evening he came into the kitchen, his face grim and his clothes covered in dust and sweat. "We're short on hands," he announced, his voice gruff. "One of the new hires quit. The fence needs mending on the east line." Eliza looked up from the table where she was rolling out pie crust. "I can help," she said simply. Jake's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise in their depths. "You? A baker?" "I've mended a fence or 2 in my day," she replied, her voice steady. "My husband and I had a small farm. I know my way around a hammer." He studied her for a moment, a strange look passing over his face. He seemed to be weighing her words, seeing her not just as a hired hand, but as a person with skills and a past. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "All right, be ready at dawn." He turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. He looked at her, then back at the table where she was working. "The bread, it's good," he muttered, his voice so low she almost missed it. Then he was gone. Eliza stood there for a moment, the pie crust forgotten. It was the first compliment he had given her, the first crack in his hard exterior. It was a small thing, but in the desolate quiet of the ranch, it felt like a monumental shift. She knew then that she had to keep trying, for the sake of the silent child, and for the promise of a home she could finally call her own. The morning sun was a cold, pale disk in the sky as Eliza met Jake at the barn. He had 2 horses saddled, and a small bag with tools and provisions was tied to one of the saddles. He handed her a pair of worn leather gloves, their fingers stiff with age. "Put these on," he said. "The wire is sharp." She pulled them on, the leather a bit too large for her hands, but they would do. As they rode out, a fine layer of dust rose from the ground with every hoofbeat. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the creak of the saddles and the soft thud of the horses' hooves. Eliza watched the landscape unfold, the endless plains giving way to gentle hills dotted with hardy brush. After an hour of riding, they reached a long stretch of fence that was broken in several places. The wooden posts were rotted, and the barbed wire lay on the ground in a tangled mess. Jake dismounted and began to work immediately, his movements efficient and powerful. He didn't explain what he was doing, he simply did it, pulling out the old posts, digging new holes and stretching the new wire taut with a pair of pliers. Eliza, watching him for a moment, picked up a shovel and began to dig a new post hole next to him. He glanced at her, a look of mild surprise on his face. "I've done this before, sir," she said, her voice a little louder than she intended. He didn't respond, but he didn't stop her either. They worked side by side for a long time, the only sounds the scraping of the shovel, the thud of the hammer on the fence posts, and the clang of the wire. The work was hard and unforgiving. Her back ached, her hands were sore despite the gloves, and the sun began to beat down on them, relentless and hot. Still, she kept pace with him, her resolve fueled by a stubborn pride. She was not just a baker. She was a woman who could work and survive. Around midday, Jake stopped and pulled out a canteen. He offered it to her without a word. Eliza took a long, grateful drink. The water was cool and refreshing. As she handed it back, she noticed a faint scar that ran from his temple, disappearing into his hair. It was thin and white, a sign of an old wound. She wondered about it, but knew better than to ask. They sat down in the shade of a large mesquite tree to eat. Jake pulled out 2 thick sandwiches, wrapped in a cloth. Eliza recognized the bread. It was her own. He ate in silence, his eyes scanning the horizon, always alert, always on guard. She ate her sandwich slowly, savoring the simple meal. "This is good," Jake said suddenly, his voice low and a little rough. He gestured to the sandwich. "The bread. It's the best I've had in years." Eliza smiled. "Thank you. It's an old family recipe." He looked at her, a rare moment of direct eye contact. "You don't talk much." "Neither do you," she replied, her smile widening a little. He almost smiled back, a fleeting, almost imperceptible twitch of his lips. "I'm a man of few words. The land, it teaches you that." "I think the silence is more of a choice," she said quietly. "For you and for Lily." His face hardened instantly. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, the shutters coming down again. "Lily's silence is her own business." "Perhaps," Eliza said gently, not backing down. "But a child's silence often speaks the loudest. She needs someone to hear it." He didn't reply. The moment of connection was gone, replaced by a wall of his grief and anger. The rest of their lunch was spent in silence. They worked for a few more hours before heading back to the ranch. As they rode, the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink. The landscape, so harsh and unforgiving in the daylight, was transformed into something breathtakingly beautiful. Eliza took a moment to truly look at it, a sense of awe filling her. Jake, sensing her gaze, looked up at the sky as well. For a few brief seconds, they were just 2 people sharing the same sky, the same quiet, vast beauty of the West. He was a man of the land, a part of its rugged beauty and its brutal honesty. She was an outsider, but she was starting to understand its silent language. As they neared the ranch, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You're a good worker, Eliza, better than some of the men I've hired." "I'm a good baker too," she said, a playful note in her voice. He looked at her, and this time a real, if brief, smile touched his lips. It was the first time she had seen it, and it transformed his face, making him look less like a man of stone and more like a man of flesh and blood. It was a fleeting glimpse into the man he might have been, a man buried under layers of grief and responsibility. She knew then that she was not just here to mend fences, but to try and mend a broken family, one small piece at a time. The small moments of shared work and quiet conversation didn't dismantle Jake's walls, but they did create tiny cracks. He would still come into the kitchen and leave without a word, but sometimes he would stop for a moment, his eyes lingering on the small plate of food Eliza had prepared for Lily. He never commented on the bread animals or the carefully arranged vegetables, but he noticed. One evening, after a long day of working the herd, Jake came into the kitchen to find Eliza sitting at the long table, a small oil lamp casting a warm glow on her face. In her hands she held a large, well-worn book. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes fixed on the sight. It was the first time he had seen her at rest, not working, not baking. "What's that?" he asked, his voice low. Eliza looked up, surprised. "It's a book of fairy tales. My mother gave it to me." She held it up. "My husband's name was David. He used to read them to me." Jake nodded slowly, a dark cloud crossing his features. "Lily's mother. She used to read to her every night." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife. Eliza felt a wave of sympathy wash over her. She gently closed the book and placed it on the table. "I'm so sorry, Jake." He shook his head, a quick, jerky motion. "Doesn't matter now, she's gone." His voice was hard, a shield against the pain. He collected his dinner from the counter and turned to leave. "Jake," she said softly. He stopped and looked back. "Lily needs to hear a story. She needs to hear a voice. She needs to hear someone tell her she's not alone." His jaw tightened. "She's not alone. She has me." "A child needs more than just a provider," Eliza countered gently. "She needs comfort. She needs to know that the world isn't just a place of loss. She needs to know there's still magic in it, even if it's just in a story." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Then, without a word, he left. Eliza was left with the silence, the flickering lamp, and the sad, worn book. She felt a deep frustration. How could he not see what was right in front of him? His love for his daughter was clear, but his grief had built a wall between them, a wall that was suffocating them both. The next morning, she was surprised to find Jake waiting for her by the kitchen door. He didn't speak, but he gestured with his head towards the main hall. Eliza, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear, followed him. He led her to a small sitting room off the main hall. The room was dark and dusty, the furniture covered in white sheets. He pulled a sheet off a large, comfortable-looking armchair, revealing a beautiful hand-carved piece of furniture, the wood a dark cherry color. It was the kind of chair a person would sit in to read a book, a place of comfort and rest. "I found it in the cellar," he said, his voice flat. "It was her favorite chair. She used to read to Lily here." Eliza looked at him, her eyes wide. This was a gesture, a raw, painful admission of his grief and his struggle. He was asking for her help in his own silent way. I can't do it, Eliza," he confessed, the words a strained whisper. "Every time I try, I can't. The words get stuck in my throat. I just see her face, and I can't." His voice trailed off, a raw vulnerability in his eyes. Eliza moved forward, her hand reaching out and gently touching his arm. "It's all right, Jake," she said softly. "It's all right. I can. I'll do it. You don't have to." He looked at her, a mix of gratitude and shame on his face. He nodded once, a brief jerky motion, and then left the room, his shoulders slumped. Eliza was alone in the sitting room, the lamplight barely pushing back the darkness. She carefully took the book of fairy tales from the kitchen and returned to the armchair. She sat down, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the armrests. The chair still held the faint scent of old lavender and a faint hint of dust. She sat there for a long time, just letting the silence settle around her. She was no longer just a baker. She was now a storyteller, a guardian of fragile memories, and a bridge between a man and his grief, and a little girl and her lost childhood. She would do her best to fill that silence, to make this house feel like a home again, for a man who had forgotten how to live, and a child who had never truly had the chance. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant shades of gold and violet, Eliza sat in the armchair in the sitting room, her voice a soft, steady murmur. She began to read from the book, the well-loved pages telling a tale of a brave princess and a kind-hearted dragon. The words flowed from her, filling the silence that had so long been a companion in that house. Jake sat in the doorway, his back to the wall, a cup of coffee held loosely in his hands. He watched her, and more importantly, he listened. He was a man of the earth, not of stories, but the simple, lyrical words of the tale seemed to calm something within him. He watched as the door to Lily's room slowly, silently, opened. The little girl's pale face appeared, her wide eyes fixed on Eliza. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but she was there, listening. Eliza, seeing her from the corner of her eye, didn't stop. She simply continued to read, her voice a warm and inviting melody. The story unfolded, and as it did, a new world was created within the old dusty walls of the ranch house. A world of possibility, of courage, and of hope. After a long time, the story ended. Eliza's voice fell silent. She gently closed the book and looked over at Lily. The little girl remained in the doorway, her expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed she would disappear again, a silent phantom in the night. But then, to Eliza's astonishment, she took one small, tentative step forward, then another. She walked slowly, quietly, until she was standing just a few feet from the armchair. She didn't speak, but she held out a small, trembling hand. In it was a single, dusty, and slightly crushed wildflower. Eliza's heart ached with a profound tenderness. She took the flower, her fingers gently brushing against the child's. "Thank you, Lily," she whispered. "It's beautiful." Lily's eyes, still wide and silent, seemed to hold a flicker of light. She didn't smile, but she didn't retreat either. She simply stood there for a moment longer, a small, fragile presence, and then she turned and walked back into her room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Jake remained in the doorway, watching the entire exchange. He didn't move or speak, but Eliza could feel the raw emotion radiating from him. The fear, the hope, the gratitude. He had hired her to bake bread, but she had brought something more, something far more valuable. She had brought life back into his daughter's eyes. He stood up, his coffee forgotten. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Thank you, Eliza." He didn't wait for a response, simply turned and walked away into the darkness of the house. Eliza sat there for a long time, holding the small crushed flower in her hand. It was a simple offering, but it was a bridge. It was a wordless communication of thanks, a sign that the little girl was finally beginning to trust her. She looked down at the book in her lap. It was more than a book of fairy tales. It was a tool of healing, a key to a world that had been closed off by grief. The next day, as Eliza began to prepare the morning's bread, she made a new shape. She kneaded a small piece of dough and molded it into the form of a flower, carefully placing a few tiny bits of dried fruit in the center to look like petals. She baked it until it was golden and placed it on the kitchen table with a glass of milk. Later, when she came back into the room, both the flour and the milk were gone. The communication, the silent connection had been established. It was a fragile and delicate thing, but it was real. As she went about her day, she found herself humming again, a simple, sweet melody. The house, which had once felt like a tomb, now felt like a home waiting to be filled. And she was the one, the quiet baker, who was starting to fill it, one story and one piece of bread at a time. The work was hard. The ranch was still a brutal place, but now there was a reason to keep going that went far beyond mere survival. She was fighting for something more, something that was beginning to feel a lot like a family. The small acts of kindness and the shared moments of silence began to build a new kind of rhythm at the ranch. Eliza continued to bake her bread, to make her small bread-shaped offerings for Lily, and to read her stories every night. Lily, in turn, began to emerge from her shell. She would come into the kitchen now, silently observing Eliza as she worked. She would sit at the far end of the long table, her feet dangling, her eyes watching every movement. Eliza would talk to her as she worked, her voice a gentle patter of sound in the quiet room. "I've been thinking about what to bake for tomorrow," she would say. "Maybe some molasses cookies. They're your father's favorite." Lily wouldn't respond, but she would listen, her gaze steady and intent. Sometimes Eliza would ask her a question. "Do you like raisins?" she asked one day, holding a small box of the dried fruit. Lily simply stared at the box. Eliza took a few and placed them in a small bowl on the table. Later, she saw that they were gone. It was progress, a slow, gentle blossoming. The ranch itself, however, remained a place of constant tension. One afternoon, a rider came galloping up to the house, his horse a lather of sweat. He was a foreman from a neighboring ranch, and his face was grim. He dismounted quickly and rushed into the house, his spurs clanking loudly on the wooden floors. "Jake, the east fence is down again, looks like it was cut, and a dozen head of cattle are missing. The tracks lead right to Carson's land." Eliza, who was in the kitchen, stopped what she was doing, her heart pounding. She had heard the name Carson whispered by the men on the ranch before. He was a rival rancher, known for his ruthless tactics and his covetous eyes on Jake's land. Jake emerged from his study, his face a thundercloud. He listened to the foreman's report, his jaw set, his eyes hard and cold. "I'll go," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Get the men ready. We ride at dawn." The foreman left, and the house fell into a tense, heavy silence. The peaceful afternoon was gone, replaced by the ominous threat of violence. Eliza looked at Jake, his back to her, as he stared out the window, his hands clenched into fists. He was a man of peace when it came to his family, but a man of war when it came to his land. "Jake," she said softly, "be careful." He didn't turn around. "This is not your concern, Eliza. Stay in the house." His voice was a warning, a command. He was pushing her away again, building his walls higher to protect her, but also to separate himself from the softness she had brought into his life. That evening, the house was filled with a chilling quiet. Lily was nowhere to be seen, having retreated back into the shadows. Jake was in his study, a lamp burning late into the night. Eliza couldn't sleep. She sat by the fireplace, the flames a weak reflection of the fire of fear burning in her heart. She was no longer a stranger here. The ranch, the silent child, the man with the burdened eyes, they had all become a part of her world, and she was terrified for them. She remembered the look in Jake's eyes when he was talking to the foreman. It was the look of a man who was ready for a fight, a man who was willing to risk everything. She knew then that she had to do something. She couldn't just sit and wait. She had to try and help. But what could a baker do against a cattle thief? The answer came to her in the quiet hours before dawn, when the darkness was at its deepest and the world was still. She knew what she had to do. It was foolish, it was dangerous, and it was a direct violation of Jake's command. But she couldn't just stand by. She had to take a risk. She was a woman who had lost everything once. She was not afraid to fight for what she had found again. She dressed quickly, a sense of grim determination settling over her. She grabbed a small satchel and a canteen of water. She didn't know the land as well as Jake, but she knew the general direction of the east fence. She would ride out to where the fence was down. She didn't know what she would find, but she knew she had to try. She had to find a way to help, to show Jake that he didn't have to face his demons alone. She had to fight for the future of this ranch, for the future of this silent family. The pre-dawn light was a pale pearly grey as Eliza led her horse from the barn. The air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. She rode out quietly, a small, dark figure against the vast, empty landscape. She knew she was being reckless. She was a woman alone in a dangerous land, on a mission she was ill-equipped for. But she was not a woman who could stand idly by. She rode east, following the path Jake and his men would take. The tracks of their horses were clearly visible in the dusty soil. As she rode, the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in a wash of soft pinks and oranges. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. What if they had already encountered Carson and his men? What if there had been a fight? She rode for a little over an hour, her horse's rhythmic pace a hypnotic beat. Then, in the distance, she saw them. Not Jake's men, but a small group of riders, silhouetted against the rising sun. They were moving a small herd of cattle, and they were heading west back towards Carson's ranch. Eliza's heart pounded. She had found them. She dismounted and hid her horse in a small ravine, the brush providing a perfect cover. She crept to the edge of the ravine and watched. There were only 2 men, a surprisingly small number for a cattle rustling operation. They were young and looked to be inexperienced. The cattle, a dozen or so head, were branded with Jake's Bar M mark. As she watched, she noticed something. The men were not just driving the cattle. They were also carrying several bags and boxes tied to their saddles. She squinted, trying to make out what they were. As they got closer, she saw it. They were bags of flour, sacks of sugar, and boxes of canned goods. It was the same food from the ranch's supply room. They weren't just rustling cattle. They were robbing the house as well. A cold sense of rage, pure and clean, settled over Eliza. This was no simple crime of opportunity. This was personal. They were not just stealing from Jake, they were trying to ruin him, to starve him and his family out. The thought of Lily going hungry, of Jake losing everything he had worked for, filled her with a fierce protective fury. She knew she couldn't take them on. She was a baker, not a fighter, but she was a woman with a quick mind and a heart full of courage. She had to think of something. She watched them for a few more minutes. Then she had an idea. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. She crept back to her horse and mounted it. She wouldn't confront them directly. She would ride ahead, as fast as she could, and try to get to Jake and his men before they did something rash. She would warn them that this wasn't just about cattle. It was about something far more insidious. She rode hard, the wind whipping through her hair, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The ranch was still a long way off, but she pushed her horse to its limits. She had to get there in time. She had to make him listen. She was not a woman of great physical strength, but her spirit was as strong as any man's. She had survived loss, and she was not about to lose again. Not this place, not this family. She had found something here, something that was beginning to feel a lot like hope, and she would fight for it with every ounce of strength she had. She thought of the little girl, of her silent, questioning eyes. She thought of the burdened man, of his quiet acts of kindness. They had become her people, and she would do whatever it took to protect them. The sun was now high in the sky, and the heat was beginning to rise, but Eliza didn't slow down. She was on a mission, a small, determined woman riding into a conflict that was far bigger than she was. She was no longer just a baker. She was a defender, a protector, a new kind of hero on the desolate plains of the West. Eliza rode as if the devil himself was at her heels. She pushed her horse past its limits, the rhythmic pounding of its hooves a desperate drumbeat in her ears. She was a baker, a weaver of stories, a woman who found comfort in the quiet of a kitchen, and yet here she was, in the heart of a conflict that was far beyond her. She saw them first, a small cloud of dust in the distance. It was Jake and his men riding hard and fast, their guns holstered, and their faces set with grim purpose. They were on the trail of the cattle rustlers, and they were closing in. Eliza knew she had to intercept them before they reached the two men. A direct confrontation would only lead to bloodshed, and she had seen what was truly at stake. It wasn't just about the cattle. It was about the future of the ranch, about a man's livelihood and a little girl's last hope. She reined her horse in, letting out a sharp cry. "Jake, wait, stop!" He heard her, and to her immense relief, he and his men pulled their horses to a sudden halt. He looked at her, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "Eliza, what in God's name are you doing out here?" he shouted, his voice a low rumble. "I told you to stay in the house. I saw them," she gasped, out of breath, her chest heaving. "The men who took the cattle. They're not just after the herd. They took supplies from the house. Food, flour, supplies. They're trying to starve you out." Jake's eyes narrowed, a cold fury rising in their depths. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, I saw the sacks of flour on their saddles. They're heading west towards Carson's ranch. There are only two of them." Jake exchanged a look with his foreman, a grizzled old man named Hank. "Two of them?" Hank said, his voice skeptical. "Carson never works with just two men." "He's trying to make you think it's a small crew," Eliza said, a sudden clarity in her voice. "He wants you to ride in fast, guns blazing, and then he'll ambush you. He'll be waiting for you, Jake. He's probably got a dozen men hiding in the hills, waiting for you to walk right into a trap." Jake looked at her, a long, searching gaze. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, but he also saw the unshakable determination. She was a woman who was terrified, but she was not a woman who was lying. He trusted her. He had to. He had seen the way she had cared for his daughter, the way she had brought life back into a silent house. He knew she would not risk her life for a lie. He turned to his men. "We're not going in hot. We'll circle around and come at them from the north. We'll approach on foot. We'll take them by surprise." The men looked at each other, surprise on their faces. It was a risky plan, a departure from their usual confrontational tactics. But they trusted Jake, and they could see the weight of his decision in his eyes. "Hank, you and two others stay here with Eliza. Keep her safe. We'll be back," Jake commanded. "No," Eliza said, her voice firm. "I'm coming with you." Jake's face hardened. "No, it's too dangerous. You're staying here." "I'm the one who found them," she countered, her eyes fixed on his. "I know what I saw. I know where they're headed. I can help. Besides," she added, a note of grim humor in her voice, "I'm not leaving my flour with those thieves." Jake stared at her, a mix of frustration and grudging admiration on his face. He knew he couldn't win this argument. He also knew she was right. She had a keen eye and a quick mind, skills that would be invaluable in this situation. He gave a sharp nod. "All right, but you stay behind me. Don't make a sound." Eliza nodded, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over her. She was in this now, and there was no turning back. She was no longer just a baker. She was a partner, a fighter, a woman who had found something worth fighting for, and she was ready to stand her ground. The sun was now high in the sky, a blazing inferno, and the world was hot and still. But the silence was now charged with a new kind of energy, the energy of two people, a man and a woman, standing together against a common enemy. They rode in a wide, sweeping arc, keeping to the low-lying hills and brush, their movements as silent and purposeful as shadows. The ranchmen were seasoned riders, but Eliza was a quiet presence, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her heart a steady, determined beat in her chest. The tension was a palpable thing, a weight that settled over the small group as they moved closer to their target. After what felt like an eternity, Jake held up his hand, signaling them to stop. He dismounted, and the men followed suit, their movements fluid and practiced. He turned to Eliza. "You stay here," he whispered, his voice low and commanding. "I mean it, Eliza. Stay here. If anything happens, ride back to the ranch as fast as you can. Don't look back." Eliza nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. She watched as Jake and his men melted into the landscape, a few dark figures moving silently through the scrub brush. She was left alone with the horses, the only sounds the soft rustle of the wind and the nervous shifting of the animals. She tried to calm herself, to breathe, but her heart was pounding in her chest like a drum. She knew what Jake was doing. He was taking a massive risk. If her information was wrong, if Carson had more men, Jake and his crew would be walking into an ambush. The thought made her stomach lurch. She had to trust him, to trust the bond that had so quickly formed between them, the fragile understanding built on silent acts of kindness and a shared love for a little girl. Suddenly, a shot rang out, loud and sharp, echoing across the hills. Eliza's breath hitched in her throat. She gripped the reins, her knuckles white. Another shot, and then a series of them, a rapid succession that sounded like a storm. She wanted to ride, to run, but she knew she couldn't leave. She had to stay, to wait, to be ready if they needed her. The gunshots died down and a profound, agonizing silence fell over the land. The only sound was the thudding of her own heart in her ears. She waited and waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Had they won? Or had Jake been right to be so cautious? Had he been right about the danger, about her staying in the house? Then she heard them, a soft, shuffling sound. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Jake. He was walking slowly, his head down. A few of his men were with him, there were no cattle, and there was a man in front of them, his hands tied behind his back. It was one of the thieves. Jake walked towards her, his face grim. "He's all we found," he said, his voice low and tired. "The other one got away. We got the supplies back." Eliza looked past him, her eyes searching for any sign of blood, of a wound. He was safe. Her relief was so profound it made her knees weak. "What about Carson?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We found their camp. It was a decoy, a few tents, a fire still smoldering, a place to make us think this was a small-time operation. But Carson's men, they were waiting in the hills, just like you said. We saw their tracks. If we had gone in hot, we would have been done for." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, genuine gratitude. "You saved us, Eliza. You saved my life, and the lives of my men." Eliza's face flushed. I knew something was wrong. I just followed my instincts." Jake looked at her, a different kind of light in his eyes now. It wasn't the cold, guarded look she had seen on her first day. It was a look of respect, of admiration, of something deeper. "Instincts like that are worth more than any gun," he said. He looked at the man they had captured, a young, nervous-looking boy. "Take him back to the ranch," he commanded. "We'll let the sheriff deal with him." As the men took the boy away, Eliza and Jake were left alone. The vastness of the plains stretched out around them, the sun now high and hot. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a bridge, a quiet space where unspoken feelings could exist. "You should have stayed home," he said, but his voice lacked any real anger. "I couldn't," she replied simply. "I'm not just a baker, Jake. I'm a woman who fights for what she cares about." He looked at her then, a small, genuine smile on his lips. "I know," he said, and the way he said it, so soft and so sincere, it felt like the most important thing he had ever said to her. In that moment, on that dusty plain, under the relentless sun, something shifted. A man who had lost everything had found a new reason to hope, and a woman who had been running from her past had found a future worth fighting for. The journey back to the ranch was a quiet one, a stark contrast to the frantic ride out. The sun had climbed high in the sky, and the heat was a thick, oppressive blanket. Eliza rode her horse beside Jake's, the silence between them no longer a sign of distance, but a comfortable space filled with shared understanding. She glanced at him, his face still grim, but the lines of tension around his eyes were softer than before. He had looked at her on the plains with a new kind of respect, a recognition of her courage that had nothing to do with baking bread. It was a connection that ran deeper than their employer-employee relationship, a bond forged in the crucible of a shared danger. When they arrived back at the ranch, Lily was waiting on the porch, a small, still figure in a white dress. Her eyes were wide as she watched her father dismount, his face covered in dust and sweat. She looked at Eliza, her gaze lingering for a moment, a flicker of something in her eyes that was not fear but relief. It was a wordless welcome, a silent acknowledgement of their shared ordeal. Jake walked up to her, his movements a bit slow from the long day. He knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "Lily," he said, his voice softer than Eliza had ever heard it. "We're home. We're safe." Lily didn't respond, but she reached out and for the first time gently touched his face, her small fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Jake's eyes closed for a moment, a raw emotion passing over his face. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and Eliza felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was a man learning how to be a father again, how to be vulnerable, and it was a humbling thing to witness. The captured rustler was taken to the barn and secured, waiting for the sheriff to arrive. The men on the ranch, hearing what had happened, looked at Eliza with a newfound respect. She wasn't just the baker anymore. She was the one who had seen what they had all missed, the one who had saved them from a bloody ambush. The respect in their eyes was a new weight, a new responsibility she hadn't asked for, but which she now accepted as her own. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Jake came into the kitchen, a lantern in his hand. The day had been long and exhausting, and he looked worn out. "Eliza," he said, his voice a low rumble, I can't thank you enough. You put yourself in danger for us." "You would have done the same," she replied, her hands busy kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. "It's my home too, Jake. This ranch. This family." She didn't mean to say it, the word family a whisper in the quiet kitchen, but once it was out she couldn't take it back. Jake didn't correct her. He simply looked at her, a long, searching gaze that held a depth she had never seen before. "It is," he said, his voice soft, almost a confession. "This is our home." The words were an acknowledgement, a promise, a profound shift in their relationship. The air in the kitchen grew thick with unspoken feelings, with the quiet power of a bond that had transcended the simple transaction of work for pay. The next morning, the sheriff arrived. He was a tall, stern-looking man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. Jake explained what had happened, and the sheriff listened, his eyes occasionally flicking towards Eliza, a look of quiet admiration in them. He spoke to the captured rustler, a young man named Tommy whose face was pale with fear. Tommy, seeing the sheriff's unyielding expression, began to talk, his words a desperate, panicked torrent. He confessed that Carson had set a trap, just as Eliza had suspected. He revealed that Carson had been watching the ranch for weeks, planning to take it over, to drive Jake off the land he had worked so hard to build. The boy, it turned out, was not a cold-blooded thief, but a desperate young man, working for Carson to provide for his sick mother. The sheriff listened, his expression impassive. He then turned to Jake. "This Carson is a snake. This isn't just a dispute. He's looking for a reason to have you killed. Be careful, Jake." He looked at Eliza again. "You're a smart woman, ma'am. You've got a good head on your shoulders. You saved a lot of lives yesterday." He took the captured man, shackled him, and led him away, leaving the ranch in a new kind of silence. A silence filled not with grief, but with the quiet hum of a lingering threat. The man had been caught, but the real enemy, Carson, was still out there. The quiet war for the ranch was not over. It had only just begun, but now Eliza was no longer just a spectator. She was a player in this dangerous game, a quiet, determined force standing shoulder to shoulder with a man she was beginning to see as more than just an employer. The days that followed were filled with a tense, simmering anxiety. The captured rustler's confession relayed to the men solidified their loyalty to Jake. They were no longer just ranch hands, they were a united front against a common enemy. The quiet truce between Jake and Eliza had blossomed into an unspoken partnership. They would sit together at the kitchen table in the evenings, the day's work done, a cup of coffee between them. They talked about the ranch, about the men, and about the lingering threat of Carson. "He won't give up," Jake said one night, his voice low. "He wants this land. He's tried everything, and he'll try again." "Then we'll be ready," Eliza replied, her voice firm. "We'll be ready for him." He looked at her, a glimmer of a smile on his face. "We?" he asked. Yes, we, she confirmed, a soft smile on her own lips. You and me and everyone here. The word we felt natural, a simple truth in the quiet room. Eliza noticed subtle changes in Jake. He was still a man of few words, but the silence was no longer a wall, but a shared space. He would come into the kitchen and stay, just watching her work. He would bring her a fresh pail of water from the well, or a handful of fresh-picked vegetables from the garden. Small, unspoken gestures of care that spoke volumes. He began to ask her about her life, about her small farm and her late husband, listening with an intensity that surprised her. He was learning to open up, to trust, to let another person into the carefully guarded space of his heart. One evening, Eliza was reading a story to Lily in the sitting room, the lamplight casting a warm glow on their faces. Lily was sitting in a small chair now, a silent but engaged listener. Jake came in and stood in the doorway watching them. Eliza glanced up at him. "Come in, Jake," she said softly. "There's plenty of room." He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat on the edge of the large armchair. He didn't say a word, just listened as Eliza's voice filled the room, weaving a tale of a lonely boy and a lost dog. As the story went on, he noticed Lily's eyes, bright and attentive. She was no longer a ghost in her own home. She was a child, and she was healing. The realization was a powerful one, and Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude towards the woman who had brought so much life back into his house. When the story was over, Lily looked up at Jake. She didn't speak, but she reached out her hand and took his. Jake froze for a moment. Then his large, calloused hand gently enveloped her small one. He looked at Eliza, his eyes filled with a raw, powerful emotion. It was a silent acknowledgement of the miracle she had performed, a moment of profound thanks that didn't need words. The next day, as Eliza was starting her work in the kitchen, Jake walked in, holding a small box in his hand. He looked uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on the box as if it were a bomb. "Eliza," he said, his voice low, "I have something for you." He opened the box. Inside was a beautiful, handcrafted, leather-bound book. The cover was a rich, dark brown, and a single intricate bird was carved into it. "I made it myself," he said, his voice a little strained, "for the stories, and for you." Eliza gasped, her fingers tracing the intricate carving. The book was a work of art, a beautiful personal gift. It was more than just a book. It was a symbol of his gratitude, his admiration, and his silent affection. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Jake," she whispered, "it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Thank you." He simply nodded, his face a little red. He had given her a part of himself, a piece of his talent and his heart. She had given him back his daughter, and he had given her a symbol of his thanks, a new vessel for the stories that were healing his family. It was a trade of the most profound kind. As he walked out of the kitchen, she held the book close to her chest. She had come to the ranch for a job, but she had found something far more precious, a home and a place in the heart of a broken family. The conflict with Carson was still looming, a dark cloud on the horizon, but for the first time in a long time, Eliza felt a sense of hope that was stronger than her fear. She had found a place to belong, a reason to fight, and a quiet promise of a future that she was ready to build. With the threat of Carson looming, a new dynamic settled over the ranch. Jake began to train his men, drilling them on defensive tactics and keeping a constant watch on the borders of his land. But despite the tension, a new sense of normalcy began to grow within the main house. The scent of fresh bread and simmering stews was a constant presence, and the sound of Eliza's humming and her voice reading stories filled the once silent rooms. Jake, inspired by Eliza's quiet determination, began to take a more active role in his daughter's life. One evening after Eliza had finished a story, Jake sat down next to Lily, a book in his hand. He had found it in his late wife's things, a worn copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He held it a little awkwardly, his large hands looking out of place holding the small book. "Eliza's been teaching you about stories," he said to Lily, his voice a little strained. I thought I could try too." He opened the book and began to read. His voice was rough at first, a little hesitant, as if the words were foreign to him. He stumbled over the long sentences, his voice lacking the easy flow of Eliza's. But he didn't give up. He read on, his deep voice filling the room, the story of a boy's adventures on the Mississippi River, a strange counterpoint to the quiet tension of the ranch. Eliza watched him from the doorway, her heart swelling with a quiet joy. This was a man confronting his grief, facing a ghost from his past, and doing it for the love of his child. It was a difficult, painful thing, and yet he was doing it with a stubborn determination that was so characteristic of him. Lily, for her part, simply listened. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her eyes were fixed on her father's face, a look of profound concentration on her features. She wasn't just hearing the words, she was hearing her father, a man who had been lost to her, finally finding his way back. When Jake finished the first chapter, he looked at Eliza, his face a little flushed. "That was harder than it looks," he admitted, a note of vulnerability in his voice. Eliza walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. "It's the hardest thing a man can do, Jake, to open up your heart, but it's the most important." He looked at her, his eyes full of a powerful mix of gratitude and something more, something that was beginning to look a lot like love. He had hired a baker, and he had found a partner. He had hired a worker, and he had found a healer. He had hired a stranger, and he had found a family. The next day, a new crisis descended upon the ranch. The West was a land of extremes, and just as the sun had been a relentless enemy during the fence mending, now the lack of water was becoming a life-threatening problem. The well, a deep, old well that had served the ranch for decades, was beginning to dry up. The water level was dropping and the flow was a mere trickle. Jake gathered the men, his face grim. "The well is failing," he announced. "We have enough water for the men and the house for a week, maybe 2. But the cattle, they won't last that long. If we don't find a new source of water, we'll lose the herd. The ranch will be finished." A collective murmur of dread passed through the men. A drought was a death sentence in the West, a slow, agonizing end to a rancher's life. The prospect of losing everything after all their hard work was a heavy blow. Eliza, who had been listening from the porch, walked down to the group. "Is there a creek nearby?" she asked. Jake shook his head. "Not one that's reliable. It's been dry for months. What about a spring?" she persisted. "A natural spring." "We've looked, Eliza. There's nothing. Not for miles. The only thing to do is to go on a cattle drive, find a new grazing land with a water source." "That's a lot of work," she said quietly, "and a lot of danger. It will leave the ranch and your family exposed." "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice filled with a desperate finality. "You might," she said, her voice thoughtful. "On our farm we had a small well, and when it went dry, my father-in-law, he had an old trick. He would look for a certain kind of plant, one that only grows near an underground water source, and then he would dig. He always found it." Jake looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes, quickly followed by skepticism. "That's old-timey foolishness, Eliza. There's no way to know what's under the ground." "There is if you know what to look for," she insisted. "The plants, the land, the lay of the ground, it all tells a story, just like the clouds tell a story about a coming storm." He stared at her for a long moment, weighing her words against his skepticism. She had been right about Carson's ambush. She had a kind of wisdom that was rooted not in books but in the earth itself. He had seen her strength, her resilience, her ability to face a challenge with a quiet, unwavering resolve. He looked at his men, at their worried faces, and he knew he had to try. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We'll try it. We'll look for your plants. We'll start digging. But we have to work fast. We're running out of time." Eliza smiled. "We will, Jake," she said. "We will." The threat of Carson was a constant companion, but now a new enemy had emerged, one that was far more powerful and unforgiving than any man. The earth itself was testing them, and Eliza knew deep in her heart that they would face this challenge together. The search for a new water source began in earnest. Eliza, armed with a newfound authority, led the men, walking slowly over the vast, arid land. She pointed out certain types of brush, hardy desert plants with deep roots that suggested a hidden source of moisture. The men, skeptical at first, followed her lead, their faith in her born from the events of the last few weeks. Jake was always by her side, watching her, his trust a tangible thing. Days turned into a brutal, sun-drenched routine. The sun beat down on them relentlessly, turning the earth into a parched, cracked expanse. The air was thick with dust, and the sky was a relentless pale blue. The well's water level continued to drop. The sound of the pump was a slow, agonizing groan, and each drop of water was a precious commodity. The cattle were beginning to show the signs of thirst, their low moans a mournful soundtrack to the desperate search for water. The men grew tired and discouraged. The work was slow, and the results were non-existent. They would dig a test hole and find nothing but dry, unforgiving dirt. The frustration began to show. Whispers of doubt spread through the crew. "This is a fool's errand," one of the older men muttered. "We should be moving the herd, not chasing some woman's fancy." Jake, hearing the comments, pulled the man aside. "That woman saved our lives, Jim," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She saved my life. You listen to her. She knows what she's doing." Eliza, seeing the tension, understood. She knew that trust was a fragile thing, and she knew she had to show them something to give them a reason to believe. "We're close," she said to Jake, her voice a little louder than a whisper for the men to hear. "I can feel it. The land is speaking to me." Jake nodded, a silent vote of confidence. He had come to believe in her quiet wisdom, a wisdom that was rooted in her connection to the earth, a connection that had been forged on her small farm, a connection that had been born out of survival. They continued the search, the days blurring into one long, hot stretch of labor. One afternoon, as they were digging yet another test hole, Eliza stopped and stared at a particular spot. It was a small, unassuming patch of land, with a different kind of scrub brush than the rest of the area. "Here," she said, her voice firm. "Dig here. I know it." The men looked at each other, their faces filled with a tired resignation. They had dug so many holes, so many times, only to find nothing. But Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet trust. "Dig," he commanded. They began to dig, the shovels biting into the dry earth. The work was slow and exhausting. The sun was at its peak and sweat poured from their bodies. They dug for an hour, 2 hours, and then a faint change. The earth was no longer dry and dusty. It was damp. A cheer, a tired, ragged cheer, went up from the men. They dug with a renewed energy, their shovels biting into the now moist soil. They dug for another half hour, and then a gasp. A small, clear trickle of water began to seep into the bottom of the hole. It was not a gushing fountain, not a powerful spring, but it was water. Clear, cool, and clean, it was a miracle. The men stood there staring at the small growing pool of water, their faces a mix of disbelief and profound relief. Jake, his face etched with exhaustion and gratitude, turned to Eliza. He didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke volumes. He looked at her not just as a baker, not just as a partner, but as a woman who had saved them. He had been a man of the earth, a man who understood the land, but she had a deeper, more profound connection to it, a quiet magic that had saved them all from a slow, agonizing end. The work was not over. They had to dig a proper well, a larger one that would provide for the entire herd. But the hope was there now, a small, fragile light in the endless heat and dust, and it was all because of her. The men now looked at her with an unspoken reverence, their skepticism gone, replaced by a quiet awe. Eliza had not only found water, she had also solidified her place on the ranch, not just as a hired hand, but as an essential part of the family, a woman whose wisdom was as vital as any man's strength. The discovery of the water source, however small, revitalized the ranch. The men, no longer burdened by the threat of a slow, agonizing death for the herd, worked with a renewed vigor. The digging began in earnest, a grueling, back-breaking task under the relentless sun. Eliza worked alongside them, not with a shovel, but with a purpose that was just as vital. She kept the men fed and hydrated, her presence a calming, steady influence. She would bring them fresh water from the old well, now used only for drinking, and cool cloths for their faces. Her quiet, steady care was a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. Jake, his trust in her solidified, relied on her counsel more and more. He would come to her in the evenings, his body exhausted, his face grimed with dirt and sweat, and they would talk, not just about the well, but about the future of the ranch, about Lily, about everything. He had, in his own way, found a place of refuge in her company, a place where he could let his guard down and simply be. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the kitchen, Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw honesty. "I didn't think we were going to make it, Eliza," he confessed, his voice a low rumble. I thought we were done for." "We're not done yet," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "We're not finished until the work is done, until that water flows, until the cattle are safe." He smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "I know. It's just, I'm a rancher, Eliza. I know the land. I know the animals. But you, You know the heart of it all. You see things I don't. She shook her head. I just have a different way of looking. We all have something to bring to the table, Jake. He didn't reply, but his gaze lingered on her, a silent appreciation for her quiet strength. He had been a man who had faced the world alone, a man who had built walls to protect himself and his daughter. But now with Eliza, he was beginning to see the value of a partnership, the strength that came from facing a challenge together. The digging continued for a week, a slow, arduous process. The hole grew deeper, but the water level was still far below the surface. The men were losing hope again, the initial burst of energy fading under the relentless sun. The heat was unforgiving, and a few of the men were suffering from heat exhaustion. Eliza, seeing the despair, knew she had to do something. She had to give them hope, to remind them what they were fighting for. She had a small secret stash of honey that she had been saving. She mixed it with a little bit of flour and water and made small sweet biscuits, baking them in the early morning before the heat became unbearable. She brought them out to the men, who ate them with a fierce, grateful hunger. The sweet taste, the small act of kindness, was a morale boost, a small reminder of the good things in the world that they were working to preserve. One of the men, a young boy named Tom, was not feeling well. He had been working too hard, pushing himself past his limits. He collapsed in the dirt, his face pale and clammy. The men rushed to him, their faces filled with concern. Jake, his face grim, knelt down and checked on him. "He's sick," he said, his voice low. "Heat stroke. He needs to cool down." Eliza was there in an instant. She had a bucket of water and a clean cloth. She instructed the men to lift him into the shade of the mule wagon. She began to sponge his face and neck with the cool water, her movements gentle and practiced. The boy's fever was high and he was delirious. "Water," he moaned. "Water." Eliza gently gave him a few sips from the canteen. She stayed with him, her hand on his forehead, her quiet presence a source of comfort. The men stood around helpless, watching her with a quiet awe. She was a woman of many talents, a woman who had a remedy for every ailment, a woman who could bring life back from the brink of death. She was not just a baker, she was a healer, a quiet, powerful force on the ranch that had now become so much more than a place of work. It was a place of life, of hope, of family. The incident with young Tom was a sobering reminder of the harsh realities of their situation. The men, their faces etched with concern, watched as Eliza tended to him. She worked with a calm, unhurried grace, her hands gentle as she sponged his brow with cool water. Jake stood by, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on her. He had seen her strength on the plains, her quiet wisdom in the face of a drought, but this was a different kind of strength, a profound compassion that was both humbling and awe-inspiring. After a few hours, Tom's fever broke. He was weak and exhausted, but he was lucid. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, his voice weak. "You saved me." Eliza smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "You saved yourself, Tom," she said softly. "You just needed a little rest." The men, now seeing her not just as a baker, but as a guardian of life, worked with a renewed sense of purpose. They dug with a fierce determination, their shovels biting into the earth with a rhythmic thud. The sun was still relentless, the dust still a constant presence, but they were no longer just digging for water. They were digging for survival. The well grew deeper, but the water was still a long way down. The men were working a back-breaking routine, and the long hours under the sun were taking a toll. They were all exhausted, their bodies aching, their spirits flagging. One evening, as they sat around the campfire, their faces lit by the flickering flames, an argument broke out. It was a small thing, a disagreement about who had done more work, but it was born out of a profound exhaustion and frustration. Voices rose, and a fistfight seemed inevitable. Jake stepped forward, his voice a low rumble. "Stop it," he commanded. "We're a team. We're in this together. We don't have time for this foolishness." The men fell silent, but the tension was still thick in the air. Eliza, seeing the smoldering anger in their eyes, knew that a simple command would not be enough. She walked over to the fire and with a quiet confidence began to hum a tune. It was a simple old folk song, a melody her mother had taught her. She hummed it for a long moment, the simple, sweet sound a quiet counterpoint to the men's anger. Then she began to sing, her voice soft and clear, the words of the song a gentle lullaby. She sang of a world far away from the dust and heat of the West, a world of green hills and flowing rivers. The men listened, their faces slowly softening, the anger draining from them replaced by a quiet, wistful calm. They had been so focused on the work, on the hardship, that they had forgotten the beauty of the world they were fighting for. When she finished, a profound silence fell over the camp. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then an older man, a grizzled old rancher named Silas, began to sing another song, a rough, simple ballad about the land. The other men joined in, their voices a tired but earnest chorus. The anger was gone, replaced by a sense of camaraderie, a shared bond forged in music and shared experience. Jake watched the entire exchange, his eyes fixed on Eliza. He had seen her sing to Lily, her voice a balm for the little girl's silent grief, but he had never seen her use her voice to heal a group of tired, angry men. She had a kind of quiet power, a profound ability to soothe, to calm, to heal. That was truly remarkable. He had been a man of strength, a man of action, a man who believed in solving problems with his hands. But she had shown him that true strength lay not in a hammer, but in a song. He knew then that she was not just a baker, not just a healer, but the heart of the ranch. She was the one who brought them together, the one who held them together, the one who made their struggle worthwhile. She was the reason they were all there, the reason they were all fighting, and the reason they all still had hope. The well digging continued, a slow and agonizing process. The men were now digging a proper, timber-lined well, and the work was dangerous. One of the men, a younger boy named Billy, was working at the bottom of the well, digging out dirt, when a section of the timbering gave way. A large, heavy plank came crashing down, pinning his leg. A cry of pain, sharp and agonizing, echoed from the bottom of the well. Panic erupted. The men rushed to the edge of the well, shouting, their faces filled with a raw, visceral fear. Jake, his face grim, took charge. "Lower a rope!" he commanded. "We have to get him out!" They lowered a rope and Jake began to descend, his movements quick and decisive. The men held the rope taut, their faces etched with concern. Eliza was there, her presence a quiet, calming influence. "Be careful, Jake," she whispered. He reached the bottom and with a few of the other men worked to free the boy's leg. It was a difficult, dangerous task. The timbering unstable, the risk of a full collapse a constant threat. After what seemed like an eternity, they managed to free him. The boy was in immense pain, his face pale and clammy, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Jake and the men carefully hoisted him out of the well. They laid him on the ground, his body trembling with shock. His leg was broken, a bad fracture that would require a long time to heal. The men looked at him with a helpless dread. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, and they couldn't risk moving him. "We have to set it," Jake said, his voice low and firm. The men looked at each other, their faces filled with apprehension. None of them had a medical background, and the thought of setting a broken bone was a terrifying prospect. "I can do it," Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm. Jake looked at her, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and relief. "You can?" "My husband, he broke his arm once," she said, her voice a little strained. "My mother-in-law, she taught me a few things. I can do it." She gathered a few clean cloths, a bucket of water, and a few small splints that Jake and the men had fashioned from a tree branch. The men stood around, their faces a mixture of fear and quiet awe, as she knelt beside the boy. She spoke to him in a low, calming voice, her words a quiet patter of reassurance. She was a woman of many talents, a quiet healer who could mend a person just as she could mend a broken fence. She worked quickly and efficiently, her movements precise and sure. She cleaned the wound, her face a mask of profound concentration. The boy cried out in pain as she set the bone, but she held his hand, her quiet words a constant source of comfort. When she was finished, she splinted the leg, her hands gentle but firm. "It's done," she said, her voice a low murmur. "He'll be all right. He just needs a lot of rest." Jake watched her, his heart filled with a profound sense of admiration. He had seen her strength, her courage, her quiet wisdom, but this was something else entirely. She had faced a difficult, painful task, and had done it with a kind of strength that was both physical and spiritual. She was a woman who could not only bake bread and tell stories, but who could also mend a broken bone and heal a broken spirit. That evening, as they sat by the campfire, Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, undeniable emotion. "You're an amazing woman, Eliza," he said, his voice so low that only she could hear it. "There's nothing you can't do." Eliza smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "There's a lot I can't do, Jake," she said softly. "But I can do this. I can help. It's just, I've learned that a person is not defined by what they've lost, but by what they have left to give." He didn't reply, but he looked at her with an intensity that was more powerful than any words. He had been a man who had lost everything, a man who had been running from his grief, but she had shown him that there was still so much to give, so much to live for. She had given him back his daughter, she had saved his ranch, and now she was slowly, quietly, mending his broken heart. The days blurred into a grueling cycle of heat, dust, and labor. The well was nearing completion, but the work was relentless, and the men were on the brink of exhaustion. The drought had intensified, and the air was thick with a fine, gritty dust. The cattle were in a desperate state, their cries a mournful sound that echoed across the plains. The old well was now a mere puddle, and the water ration had been cut to a bare minimum. The ranch was on a knife's edge, a single bad day away from a full collapse. The men's morale was at an all-time low. They worked in a grim, exhausted silence, their faces etched with a profound despair. Eliza, seeing the hopelessness in their eyes, knew she had to do something. She had to give them a reason to keep going, a reason to push on through the final, most brutal stretch of the work. She had a small secret stash of dried fruit and molasses, a few precious items she had been saving for a special occasion. She mixed them together, and in the heat of the day, she began to make a large batch of what she called hope cakes. They were simple cakes, made with a few ingredients, but they were rich and sweet, a taste of a better world. She brought them out to the men, who ate them with a fierce, desperate hunger. The small, sweet morsels were a taste of home, a taste of a future that seemed to be slipping away from them. Jake watched her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and a profound admiration. He had been a man who had carried the weight of the ranch on his shoulders, a man who had shouldered the burden of his family's survival alone. But now he had a partner, a woman who, with a few simple ingredients and a quiet, unwavering spirit, could bring them all back from the brink of despair. That evening, as they sat together, the silence between them was heavy with a shared anxiety. The sky was a hazy, pale orange, the sun a fierce, unrelenting ball of fire. There was no relief in sight. "I don't know if we'll make it, Eliza," Jake said, his voice a low whisper. "I don't know if the water will come. I don't know if we have enough time." "We will," she said, her voice firm. "We will make it. We have to. We are so close, Jake. Just a little more." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, honest fear. What if it doesn't work? What if there's no water? What then? Eliza reached out and took his hand, her fingers gentle and firm. "Then we'll start over," she said simply. "We'll find a new way. We'll find a new place. We'll face it together. We won't give up. Not as long as we have each other." He squeezed her hand, a small, grateful gesture. Her words were a balm to his tired spirit, a promise of a future that was not defined by success or failure, but by a shared purpose, a shared love. She had come to his ranch as a hired hand, but she had become his strength, his hope, his future. As the sun began to set, a strange thing happened. A few dark clouds, thin and hazy, began to appear on the horizon. The wind, which had been a relentless, hot breath, began to shift, a cool, gentle breeze wafting over the plains. The men, their eyes fixed on the sky, felt a flicker of hope, a storm, a potential end to the drought. But with the promise of rain came a new threat. A storm in the west was a dangerous, violent thing, a powerful force of nature that could destroy everything in its path. If they didn't finish the well before the storm hit, all of their work would be for nothing. The rain would flood the half-dug well, filling it with mud and debris, and they would have to start all over again. The pressure was on. The men, seeing the storm clouds gather on the horizon, knew they were in a race against time. They worked through the night, the only light, the flickering lamps and the glow of the half-moon. They worked with a fierce, desperate energy, their shovels biting into the earth with a frantic, unyielding rhythm. They were on the brink of collapse, but they had a new reason to fight. They were fighting for their future. They were fighting for hope. And they were fighting for the woman who had brought that hope to them. The night air was filled with a frantic energy. The sky, once a clear, cloudless expanse, was now a bruised, ominous purple, the lightning a silent, brilliant flash on the horizon. The thunder was a low, distant rumble, a drumbeat of the coming storm. The men, working by lamplight, were a tireless army, their shovels biting into the earth with a desperate, rhythmic thud. The well was deep now, the timbering in place, but they still hadn't reached the water. Eliza worked alongside them, her hands busy hauling up the last of the dirt, her voice a low, encouraging murmur. She had no strength left, no energy to spare, but she pushed herself past her limits, fueled by a powerful, unwavering resolve. She was a woman who had given everything, and she would not stop until the work was done. Jake worked with a fierce, single-minded focus, his face grimed with dirt and sweat, his body a testament to his determination. He had been a man who had faced the world alone, but now, with Eliza by his side, he was a new kind of man, a man who was fighting not just for himself but for a family he was now a part of. The storm was getting closer. The wind began to pick up, a hot, swirling gust that whipped the dust into a frenzy. The thunder was now a loud, commanding roar, and the lightning a constant, violent flash. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the promise of rain. "We're almost there," one of the men shouted, his voice a ragged whisper. "Keep digging," Jake commanded, his voice a low, furious growl. "Keep digging!" They dug with a final, desperate burst of energy. The shovels scraped against the bottom of the well, and then a gasp. A small, clear trickle of water began to seep into the bottom of the well. It was not a flood, not a gushing torrent, but it was there. The men stood there, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief, their faces a mix of disbelief and triumph. Then a sudden, blinding flash of lightning, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The sky opened up, and the rain began to fall. Not a gentle shower, but a heavy, violent downpour. The water hit the dry earth, turning it into a thick, clinging mud. The men cheered, their voices a triumphant roar. They had made it. They had won. Eliza and Jake stood at the edge of the well, the rain pouring down on them, washing away the dust and sweat from their faces. The water level in the well was rising, slowly but surely. It was a testament to their hard work, their resilience, and their faith. They had faced the impossible, and they had won. Jake looked at Eliza, his face a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a profound, undeniable love. The rain was streaming down her face, and her clothes were clinging to her body, but she was radiant, her face lit by a glow that was more powerful than any lamplight. She had not only saved his ranch, she had saved his family, she had saved him. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. The unspoken emotions of the last few weeks, the quiet understanding, the shared struggles, the profound respect, all came together in that one moment, in that quiet, powerful touch. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, honest gratitude, and she looked back at him, her eyes filled with a love that was as deep and as vast as the land itself. The storm raged around them, the thunder a powerful echo of their shared victory, the rain a cleansing wash that was washing away the dust of the past. They were two people who had been lost, who had found each other, and who had built a new future together. In that moment, on that rain-soaked night, Jake knew with a sudden, powerful clarity that he was not just a rancher who had hired a baker. He was a man who had found his partner, his hope, his love, and he would never let her go. The storm was a powerful force of nature, a violent cleansing wash that transformed the parched, dusty land into a world of mud and life. The well, now filled with clear, cool water, was a testament to their hard work, their resilience, and their faith. The men, their faces a mix of exhaustion and triumph, stood in the pouring rain, cheering, their voices a triumphant roar against the backdrop of the storm. They had faced the impossible, and they had won. Eliza and Jake stood together at the edge of the well, the rain a constant stream over their faces. The moment was a quiet, profound one, a shared victory that was more powerful than any words. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, undeniable emotion, and she looked back at him, a tired, genuine smile on her lips. They were no longer just an employer and an employee. They were partners, a team, a quiet force that had faced down a storm and a drought and had emerged victorious. The next morning, the ranch was transformed. The air was cool and clean, the earth a rich, dark mud. The cattle, their bodies once gaunt and listless, were now filled with a new energy, their lowing a sound of contentment. The ranch had been given a new lease on life, a new beginning. The men, their spirits high, set about the work of rebuilding. The half-built bunkhouse, which had been put on hold due to the drought, was now a priority. The fences, which had been left to fend for themselves, were now being mended. The ranch was a bustling, lively place, a world away from the quiet, grief-stricken place Eliza had first arrived at. Jake and Eliza's relationship had entered a new phase. It was no longer just a professional partnership. It was a deep, unspoken bond. He would come to her in the evenings, his face clean and tired, and they would sit together, not talking much, but simply enjoying the quiet of each other's company. He would watch her as she prepared dinner, her movements a graceful, practiced rhythm. He would watch her as she read to Lily, her voice a soothing balm that filled the once silent house. He had never been a man who believed in words, but he knew now that a person's actions could speak louder than any words. He had seen her courage, her compassion, her quiet strength, and he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he was falling in love with her. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, a book of stories between them, he looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Eliza," he said, his voice a low rumble, "what will you do now? Now that the well is done and the ranch is safe?" The question hung in the air between them, a sudden, jarring note in their quiet comfort. She looked at him, her heart pounding. The ranch was safe. The work was done. Her contract was for a specific purpose, and now that purpose had been fulfilled. She was a woman of honor, a woman who had come to do a job, and now that job was finished. "I don't know," she said, her voice a little shaky. I haven't thought about it." He looked at her, a deep, unsettling sadness in his eyes. He had been so consumed with the work of survival that he had forgotten that she was a woman with a life of her own, a woman who had her own future to consider. The thought of her leaving, of the silence returning to the house, of the light in his daughter's eyes fading, the thought was a chilling one, a profound and agonizing emptiness. "Don't go," he said, the words a raw, honest whisper. "Please, don't go." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and a profound tenderness. She had come to his ranch to survive, but she had found something more. She had found a home, a purpose, a family. She had found a man who, in his quiet, burdened way, had opened up his heart to her. "I won't," she said, her voice firm. "I won't go, Jake." He didn't say another word, but he reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. It was a silent promise, a wordless confession of his feelings. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the quiet house, a warm and comforting presence. They were a family now, a new kind of family, forged not in blood, but in a shared struggle, a shared love, and a shared hope for a future that was no longer an empty, uncertain expanse, but a world of possibility. With Eliza's promise to stay, a new chapter began at the ranch. The tension that had been a constant companion was now replaced by a quiet, contented peace. The ranch was thriving, the new well providing an endless supply of clear, cool water. The men were happy, their work no longer a desperate struggle, but a fulfilling, productive routine. The house was filled with the scent of fresh bread and the sound of laughter, and the spirit of the ranch had been reborn. Jake and Eliza's relationship deepened with each passing day. He was no longer the silent, withdrawn man she had first met. He was a man who smiled easily, who found joy in the small, simple moments of life. He would sit with her in the evenings, his large frame relaxed and at ease, and he would talk to her about his day, about his plans for the ranch, about the dreams he had for his daughter's future. He had found a partner, a confidant, a quiet strength that he had never known he was missing. Lily, for her part, was flourishing. The ghost of her grief had finally retreated, replaced by a quiet but unmistakable joy. She would come into the kitchen and watch Eliza work, her eyes wide with curiosity. She would ask questions, her small voice a little hesitant at first, but growing more confident with each passing day. She had found a mother figure in Eliza, a gentle, loving presence that had filled the empty space in her heart. One afternoon, as Eliza was tending to the garden, a small, worn photograph fell from her pocket. It was a picture of her late husband, a handsome, kind-looking man with a gentle smile. She stood there for a long moment looking at the picture, a wave of sadness and nostalgia washing over her. "He looks like a good man," a voice said, soft and low. Eliza looked up. Jake was standing there, his face a mask of sympathy. He had seen the picture, had seen the look on her face. He was not a man who was used to dealing with emotions, but he knew instinctively that this was a moment that required a quiet, gentle touch. "He was," she said, her voice a little choked. "He was a very good man. I loved him very much." "He was lucky to have you," Jake said, his voice a low rumble. "He was a very lucky man." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. He didn't try to comfort her, didn't try to say the right thing. He simply stood there, his presence a quiet, powerful source of strength. He understood her grief, her love for her late husband. He was not a man who was threatened by the past. He was a man who understood it, who respected it, who knew that a person's history was a part of who they were. "I've been running for so long," she confessed, the words a quiet whisper. "Running from the memories, running from the empty house, running from the past." "You don't have to run anymore," he said, his voice a low, firm promise. "You're home now, Eliza. You're safe." He reached out and gently took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. The touch was a powerful one, a quiet confession of his feelings. She had been running from her past, but she had found a future in his quiet, gentle touch. She had found a man who understood her, who accepted her, who loved her not just for who she was now, but for who she had been and for the life she had lost. The wound of her grief was still there, but now it was a scar, a part of her story, a part of a past that had led her to a future filled with hope, a future filled with love. The new well was a lifeline, but it was also a source of pride for the ranch. Jake and his men had worked tirelessly to build it, and the finished product was a testament to their grit and determination. They had a surplus of water now, and Jake, with Eliza's counsel, decided to use it to expand the ranch. He began to plant new crops, to expand the grazing lands, to build new barns and corrals. The ranch was no longer just about survival, it was about prosperity. The threat of Carson, however, was a constant, unspoken shadow. The captured rustler had been a wake-up call, a reminder that their peace was fragile, their safety a temporary illusion. Jake, ever vigilant, had taken on new ranch hands, men who were not just hired hands, but who were loyal, trustworthy partners. He had built a small but formidable army, a quiet force of men who were ready to defend the ranch and their way of life. Eliza, seeing the tension in him, knew that he was still burdened by the threat. He was a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, a man who was always on guard. She wanted to help him, to show him that he didn't have to face this alone. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, a map of the ranch between them, she reached out and gently took his hand. "Jake," she said, her voice soft, "you're a man of many talents. You're a rancher, a leader, a father. But you're not an army. You're not alone in this." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, honest fear. "He's coming, Eliza," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I can feel it. He's been quiet for too long. He's plotting something. Then we'll be ready," she said, her voice firm. "We'll be ready for him. But you have to trust the men, Jake. You have to trust me. You can't carry this burden alone." He looked at her, a profound gratitude in his eyes. He had been so used to being alone, to shouldering the weight of his responsibilities alone, that the thought of sharing the burden was a foreign, but a welcome one. He squeezed her hand, a small, grateful gesture. She was a woman who saw him for who he was, a man with fears and vulnerabilities, and she was a woman who loved him all the same. The next day, as Eliza was walking through the ranch, a young boy, a new hand named Sam, came running up to her, his face pale with fear. "Ma'am, you have to come, it's Billy. He fell, he's hurt bad." Eliza's heart sank. Billy, the boy she had mended, had been working in the new barn and had fallen from the rafters. She ran to him, her heart pounding. He was lying on the ground, his face a mask of pain, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. It was a bad break, a complicated fracture that would require a doctor and fast. Jake was there, his face grim. "We have to get him to the doctor," he said, his voice low and firm. "We'll need to go to town. It's a 2-day ride." "I'll go with you," Eliza said, her voice firm. "He's not a strong boy. He'll need care on the way." Jake looked at her, a moment of hesitation in his eyes. The ride was dangerous, the road filled with all sorts of perils, but he knew she was right. The boy needed her. He needed her calm, quiet strength. "All right," he said. "Get your things. We leave at dawn." Eliza packed a small satchel with clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey for the pain, and a few small provisions. She was not a doctor, but she was a woman who knew how to care for the sick and the injured. She was a woman who was not afraid of a challenge, a woman who was willing to risk everything for a person she cared about. She was a woman who, in her own quiet, unassuming way, was a hero. The road to town was a dangerous one, a long, arduous journey filled with a million perils. But Eliza was not afraid. She was a woman who had faced down a drought and a storm, a woman who had mended a broken bone and a broken spirit. She was ready for whatever the road had to throw at them. She was a woman who was no longer just a baker, but a guardian, a healer, a quiet force of nature who was ready to fight for the people she loved. The journey to town was a long and arduous one. They traveled by wagon, the ride slow and agonizing. Billy lay in the back of the wagon, his face a mask of pain, his body trembling with every jolt and bump. Eliza sat with him, her hand on his brow, her voice a quiet, soothing murmur. She told him stories, not of brave heroes and beautiful princesses, but of a world he knew, of the ranch, of the men, of the quiet, beautiful moments of life. She told him about the new well, about the new crops, about the ranch's new beginning. She gave him a world to hold on to, a world to fight for. Jake rode on his horse, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his gun. The road was a dangerous place, and he knew they were vulnerable. They were a small, unarmed group, a prime target for outlaws and drifters. He had to be on guard, to be vigilant, to protect the people he loved. One afternoon, as they were resting by a small stream, they heard a sound, the unmistakable clanking of spurs, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves. A group of riders, dusty and grim-faced, emerged from the trees. There were 6 of them. Their leader, a large, imposing man with a long, dark beard and a scar that ran from his temple to his chin. It was a man Jake knew, a man who had a long history of violence and a deep hatred for Jake. "Well, well, well," the man said, his voice a low, mocking growl. "Look what we have here. Jake the rancher, and a little woman and a sick boy." Jake's hand went to his gun, his face a grim mask. "We don't want any trouble, Jed," he said, his voice low and firm. "We're just passing through." "I'll bet you are," Jed said, a cruel, mocking smile on his face. "But I think we're going to have a little trouble, Jake. I think we're going to have a lot of trouble." The men dismounted, their guns unholstered. The air was thick with a tense, menacing silence. Eliza, her heart pounding, stood up from the wagon, her hand on Billy's shoulder. She was a woman who had faced down a storm and a drought, a woman who had faced a man who had tried to steal her flower, but this was a different kind of danger, a visceral, terrifying threat. "Please," she said, her voice a little shaky but firm. "He's sick. We're just trying to get him to a doctor." Jed looked at her, his eyes a cold, hard stare. He laughed, a short, cruel sound. "He's sick, is he? Well, that's a shame. Looks like he's going to have to wait a little longer." He took a step towards them, his hand going to his gun. The moment was a terrifying one, a moment that felt like an eternity. Eliza knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was it. This was the end. But she was not a woman who would go down without a fight. She was a woman who had found a purpose, a woman who was fighting for the people she loved. Suddenly, a loud, clear sound echoed from the trees. A bird call, a simple, sweet sound that was a strange and unsettling counterpoint to the tense, menacing silence. Jed and his men stopped, their eyes darting around. The bird call was a signal, a warning, a trap. Jed looked at Jake, a cold, hard fury in his eyes. "You're a clever man, Jake," he said, his voice a low growl. "But I'll get you. I'll get you, and everything you love." He and his men mounted their horses, and with a final, menacing look they rode off, disappearing into the trees, their voices a low, angry murmur. Eliza and Jake were left alone, the silence a heavy, trembling presence. "What was that?" Eliza asked, her voice a shaky whisper. Jake looked at her, a profound sense of relief in his eyes. "It was Silas," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He's an old tracker, a man of the land. He's been following us, keeping us safe." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "You're safe now, Eliza, you're safe." They had faced a threat, a real, tangible danger, and they had survived. They had survived because of the quiet, unwavering courage of a woman who had a song for every occasion and a fierce protective love for the people she cared about. They had survived because a man who had been a loner had finally learned to trust, to rely on others, to love. The road ahead was still long and dangerous, But they were not alone. They were a team, a quiet, powerful force, a small family fighting for their place in a world that was both beautiful and brutal. The rest of the journey to town was a tense but uneventful one. The presence of Silas and the other ranch hands, moving like silent shadows in the surrounding hills, was a constant source of reassurance. Jake's men were loyal, their trust in him absolute, and their loyalty to Eliza a fierce, unspoken bond. They had seen her quiet strength, her unwavering courage, and they were willing to lay down their lives for her. When they arrived in town, it was a bustling, lively place, a world away from the quiet, isolated life of the ranch. The streets were filled with people, the sounds of conversation and commerce a loud, jarring noise. They took Billy to the town doctor, a grizzled old man with a kind, gentle face. He examined the boy, his hands calloused and sure. "It's a bad break," he said, his voice a low murmur, "but it's a clean one. It'll heal. He's a lucky boy." He looked at Eliza, a profound respect in his eyes. "You said it well, ma'am," he said. "Better than some doctors I know. He's a lucky boy to have you." Eliza simply smiled, a tired but genuine smile. She had done what she had to do. She had cared for a boy who was in pain, a boy who was a part of her new family. The doctor set the bone, his movements quick and efficient, and gave them some instructions for his care. Billy was put up in a small room in the town hotel, a quiet, comfortable space where he could rest and recover. Eliza and Jake, their work done for the moment, were left alone. The day had been long and exhausting, and they were both tired, but the tension had finally left their bodies. They walked down the main street, the sounds of the town a constant presence around them. They were two people from different worlds, a quiet baker and a burdened rancher. But they were also two people who were now inextricably linked, their lives intertwined by a shared past and a shared future. "Thank you, Eliza," Jake said, his voice a low rumble, "for everything, for coming with me, for taking care of him, for saving his life." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a quiet, profound emotion. "I would have done it for you, Jake," she said, her voice a soft, honest whisper. He stopped, his hand reaching out and gently taking hers. The touch was a powerful one, a quiet confession of his feelings. He had been so used to being a man who was alone, a man who had to be strong for himself and his daughter. But now he had a partner, a woman who was a quiet, unwavering source of strength, a woman who was a part of him now, a woman who was his future. "I need to get some things for the ranch," he said, his voice a little strained. "Supplies, provisions." "I'll help you," she said. They spent the rest of the day in town, buying supplies, talking to people, and simply being together. It was a new experience for them, a quiet, comfortable rhythm that was both new and familiar. They were two people who'd been alone for so long, and now they had found each other. They had found a home in each other's company, a quiet, comfortable space where they could simply be themselves. That evening, as they were sitting in the small hotel room, the sounds of the town a distant murmur, Jake looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Eliza," he said, his voice a low, hesitant whisper, "when we get back to the ranch, I want you to stay. I don't just mean to be the baker. I mean, I want you to be a part of my family. I want you to be my wife." The words hung in the air between them, a profound, life-changing moment. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She had come to the ranch to survive, but she had found so much more. She had found a man who was a quiet, gentle force of nature, a man who had opened his heart to her, a man who had given her a family. The tears welled up in her eyes, a mixture of joy, relief, and a profound, overwhelming love. "Yes, Jake," she said, her voice a choked whisper. "Yes." He reached out and took her in his arms, holding her close, her body trembling with a powerful, emotional release. The moment was a quiet, profound one, a silent promise of a future that was no longer a distant, empty expanse, but a world filled with hope, a world filled with love. The journey back to the ranch was a new one, a journey filled with a sense of purpose, a sense of a shared future. They rode in the wagon, Billy sleeping peacefully in the back, his legs splinted and resting comfortably. Eliza and Jake sat together, their hands often finding each other, their touch a constant, reassuring presence. They were a family now, a new kind of family, and their quiet, comfortable silence was a testament to the profound bond that had been forged between them. When they arrived back at the ranch, the men were waiting, their faces a mix of relief and joy. They had been worried about them, about the dangers of the road, and their return was a moment of celebration. They all gathered in the main house, a warm, bustling crowd. Eliza and Jake, in a quiet, simple moment, announced their engagement. The men cheered, their voices a joyous chorus. They were happy for them, happy for the ranch, happy for the new beginning. Lily, watching the scene from the doorway, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and a profound happiness, ran to Eliza and hugged her tightly. It was the first time she had initiated a hug, the first time she had shown such an open display of affection. She looked up at Eliza, a small genuine smile on her face. "You're my family now," she said, her voice a quiet, happy whisper. Eliza's heart swelled. She hugged the little girl tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. She had come to the ranch to survive, but she had found a daughter, a family, a home. She had found a purpose that was more powerful than any job, a love that was more profound than any grief. The days that followed were filled with a happy, chaotic energy. There was a wedding to plan, a life to build. The men pitched in, helping to prepare the ranch for the big day. They cleaned the house, they mended the fences, they prepared a grand feast. The entire ranch was a part of the celebration, a family unit that was coming together to celebrate a new beginning. Jake and Eliza, in the midst of the chaos, found quiet moments to be alone. They would sit together by the fire, talking about their future, their plans, their dreams. Jake was a different man now, a man who was no longer burdened by the past, but who was filled with a powerful, unwavering hope for the future. He had found a woman who was his partner, his confidant, his love. He had found a woman who was not just his wife, but the heart of his family. One evening, as they were sitting together, the moon a bright silvery disk in the sky, Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, undeniable emotion. "I never thought I would feel this way again, Eliza," he said, his voice a low, hesitant whisper. I thought my heart was a closed book. But you opened it up. You gave me back a part of myself I thought was gone forever." Eliza reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "You did the same for me, Jake," she said softly. "You gave me back a part of myself I thought I had lost forever. You gave me a home, you gave me a family, you gave me a future." He leaned in and, in a quiet, profound moment, he kissed her. It was a simple, gentle kiss, but it was a kiss that was filled with all the unspoken emotions of the last few months. It was a kiss that was a promise, a confession, a testament to a love that had been forged in the crucible of a shared struggle, a shared grief, a shared hope. It was a kiss that was a new beginning. The wedding was a small, quiet affair, held in the main living room of the ranch house. The men, dressed in their Sunday best, stood around, their faces a mixture of joy and pride. Lily, a small, beautiful flower girl, walked down the aisle, her face a serene, happy smile. Eliza, dressed in a simple but beautiful white dress, walked towards Jake, her heart pounding in her chest. Jake, dressed in his finest clothes, his face a mixture of nerves and a profound, overwhelming happiness, watched her walk towards him. He was a man who had faced down outlaws and rustlers, a man who had faced down a storm and a drought, but he was more nervous than he had ever been in his life. He was a man who was about to give his heart to a woman he loved more than life itself. The preacher, a traveling minister who had come to the ranch for the occasion, spoke a few simple, heartfelt words. He spoke of the power of love, of the beauty of a new beginning, of the strength that came from a shared purpose. He spoke of the two of them, a man and a woman who had been alone for so long and who had found each other, a quiet, powerful force in a world that was both beautiful and brutal. When the vows were exchanged, a hush fell over the room. Jake, his voice a low, firm rumble, promised to love and cherish her, to honor her, to protect her for as long as he lived. Eliza, her voice a little choked, promised to love him, to honor him, to be his partner, his confidant, his love, for all of eternity. Then, in a quiet, profound moment, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. It was a beautiful, handcrafted ring made of a simple silver band, a small, beautifully carved heart in the center. He had made it himself in the dead of the night, a quiet confession of his love. He slipped it onto her finger, the cool metal a quiet, reassuring presence against her skin. The men cheered, their voices a joyous chorus, and the room was filled with the sounds of laughter, of music, of love. The wedding was a simple one, but it was a powerful one, a testament to the power of a shared love, a shared purpose, a shared future. The reception was a boisterous, joyous affair. The men danced and sang, their voices a loud, happy chorus. There was a grand feast prepared by Eliza and a few of the other men. There was a sense of a shared community, a sense of a shared joy. The ranch was a home now, a family, a community that was coming together to celebrate a new beginning. That night, as Eliza and Jake sat together by the fire, the house quiet and still, she looked at the ring on her finger, the small, beautifully carved heart, a quiet, powerful symbol of his love. "It's beautiful, Jake," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "Thank you. I wanted to give you something that was a part of me," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Something that was a promise of my love." She smiled, a tired but genuine smile. She had come to the ranch to bake bread, but she had found so much more. She had found a man who had given her a ring, a home, a family. She had found a love that was as deep and as vast as the land itself. She was home. The days that followed were a quiet, happy blur. Eliza and Jake settled into a comfortable, easy rhythm of married life. They worked side by side, their movements a synchronized, wordless dance. They were a team, a quiet, powerful force that was working to build a new life, a new future. The ranch was thriving, the new well providing an endless supply of water. The crops were growing, the cattle were healthy, and the men were happy. The ranch was a successful, prosperous place, a world away from the struggling, desolate place it had once been. Lily, for her part, was a different child. The silence that had once been her constant companion was now replaced by a quiet but unmistakable joy. She would come to Eliza, her small hand in hers, and they would walk through the fields, talking about the world, about the animals, about the simple, beautiful things in life. She was a child who was healing, a child who was finding her voice, a child who was finding her place in a family that loved her more than anything in the world. Jake, in a quiet, unspoken way, had found a new purpose. He was no longer just a rancher, a man who was fighting for survival. He was a husband, a father, a man who was building a life, a man who was building a legacy. He was a man who was loved and who loved in return. The threat of Carson, however, was a constant, unspoken shadow. He had been quiet for too long, a silent, menacing presence on the horizon. Jake, ever vigilant, had taken on new men, men who were loyal and trustworthy, men who were ready to fight for their home. He had prepared the ranch for a siege, stocking up on supplies, training his men, building a small but formidable army. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, the house quiet and still, a rider, a young boy from a neighboring ranch, came galloping up to the house, his face pale with fear. He was out of breath, his body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and terror. "Jake!" he gasped, his voice a panicked whisper. "You have to come. Carson, he's coming. He's bringing an army. He's going to burn your ranch to the ground." The news hung in the air, a chilling, terrifying presence. The men who had been enjoying a quiet evening were on their feet in an instant. The laughter, the quiet peace, the sense of security was gone, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The moment they had all been dreading had finally arrived. Jake's face was a grim mask, his eyes filled with a cold, hard fury. He had been expecting this. He had been preparing for this. He was ready for this. "Get the men," he commanded, his voice a low, firm rumble. "We're going to make a stand. We're going to fight for our home. We're going to fight for our family." Eliza, her heart pounding, her body trembling with fear, looked at him, a question in her eyes. "Jake," she said, her voice a little shaky, "what about Lily? What are we going to do with her?" Jake looked at his daughter, who was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. He knew with a chilling certainty that he couldn't risk her life. He couldn't risk the future he had built with Eliza. He had to protect them. He had to protect his family. "We'll take her to Silas's cabin," he said, his voice a low, firm whisper. "It's a 2-hour ride. It's safe. He'll keep her safe." Eliza nodded, her face a grim mask. She knew what this meant. He was sending her away, sending his daughter away. He was preparing to face Carson alone. The thought was a terrifying one, a painful one. She had come to the ranch to build a life, a future, a family. She had not come to see it all burn down. She would not leave him. She would not leave her home. She would not leave her love. The night was a tense, agonizing blur. The men, their faces a grim mask of determination, worked tirelessly, preparing the ranch for a siege. They barricaded the doors and windows, they moved the cattle into a secure corral, they prepared their weapons. The ranch was a fortress now, a quiet, powerful force that was ready to defend itself. Jake and Eliza were in the living room, a map of the ranch between them, their voices a low, serious murmur. He was explaining his plan, a detailed, strategic plan to defend the ranch from Carson and his men. She was listening, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind a frantic, chaotic whirlwind. She was not a woman who knew about war, about fighting, about strategy. She was a woman who knew about baking bread, about mending clothes, about telling stories. But she was also a woman who was ready to fight for the people she loved. "Eliza," Jake said, his voice a low, firm whisper, "you need to take Lily and go now. You need to go to Silas's cabin. It's the only way to be safe." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and a powerful, unwavering resolve. "No," she said, her voice a low, firm whisper. "I'm not going, Jake. I'm staying here. I'm staying with you." His face hardened. "You have to go, Eliza. I can't risk your life. I can't risk Lily's life. I can't do this without knowing you're safe. Please, go." "No," she said again, her voice a little louder this time. "This is my home, Jake. This is my family. This is my life. I'm not going to run away. I'm going to stay and fight with you. We're a team, Jake. We're in this together." He looked at her, a profound sense of admiration and a deep, agonizing fear in his eyes. He had known from the moment he had met her that she was a woman of quiet strength, a woman of unwavering courage. But he had never imagined that she would be willing to risk her life for him, for their home, for their love. He reached out and took her hands, his fingers lacing with hers. "Eliza," he said, his voice a low, choked whisper, "I love you. I love you more than life itself, but I can't let you do this." "You can't stop me, Jake," she said, her voice a low, firm whisper. "I'm not leaving you. I'm not leaving our home. I'm staying right here by your side. We're a team, Jake. We're in this together. We'll face this together." He looked at her, a long, searching gaze, and then a small, tired smile touched his lips. He knew he couldn't win this argument. He also knew that he didn't want to. He had been so used to fighting his battles alone, to shouldering the weight of his world alone. But now he had a partner, a wife, a woman who was a quiet, unwavering source of strength, a woman who was ready to fight for him, for their love, for their family. He pulled her close, his arms a strong, reassuring presence around her. "All right, Eliza," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "We'll face this together. We'll fight this together. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together." The final moments of the night were filled with a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. The ranch was a fortress, the men a quiet, powerful force, and the two of them, a man and a woman who had found each other in the quiet, desolate wilderness of the West, were a new kind of army, an army of two, an army of love. The sun was about to rise, and with it, the final, most brutal battle for their home would begin. They were ready. The dawn broke over the ranch with a chilling, silent clarity. The sun was a pale, cold disk in the sky, and the air was filled with a fine, misty haze. The ranch was a fortress, the men a quiet, grim-faced army, their rifles and shotguns at the ready. The sounds of daily life, the lowing of cattle, the clanking of tools, the rhythm of a working ranch, were gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing silence. The world was holding its breath, waiting. Eliza and Jake stood together on the porch of the main house, their hands clasped, their bodies a small, still fortress against the coming storm. They had sent Lily away, a painful but necessary choice. A small note, a final goodbye, had been placed on her pillow, a note that promised her a future, a note that promised her a family, a note that promised her a love that was stronger than any battle. "They're coming," Jake said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I can feel it." Eliza squeezed his hand, a small, reassuring gesture. "We're ready," she said, her voice firm. "We're ready for them, Jake." And then they saw them. A cloud of dust on the horizon, a low, menacing rumble that grew louder with each passing second. Carson and his men. There were at least a dozen of them. A brutal, determined army, their faces grim, their guns at the ready. They were a force of nature, a terrifying, malevolent presence on the plains. The men on the ranch, seeing the enemy, took their positions. They were outnumbered, but they were not afraid. They were fighting for their home, for their family, for their way of life. They were fighting for a future that was worth dying for. Carson rode to the front of his men, his face a sneering, triumphant mask. "Jake!" he shouted, his voice a loud, booming sound that echoed across the plains. "Come out here! We know you're here! You can't hide forever!" Jake didn't move. He simply stood there, his hand on his gun, his face a grim mask of determination. He was a man who was no longer burdened by the past, but who was filled with a powerful, unwavering resolve. He was a man who was ready to fight for the people he loved. "We don't want any trouble, Carson," he shouted back, his voice a low, firm rumble. "Just turn around and go back where you came from. This is not your home. You have no business here." Carson laughed, a short, cruel sound. "It's my business now, Jake," he shouted back. "This land is mine, this ranch is mine, and everything you love is mine." The moment hung in the air, a tense, agonizing silence. Then a single shot rang out, loud and sharp. It was a warning shot, a shot that was meant to terrify, a shot that was meant to provoke. It was a shot that was meant to start a war. The war had begun. The first volley of shots came from the hills, a brutal, unyielding rain of bullets that hit the main house and the surrounding buildings. The men on the ranch returned fire, their shots a determined, angry roar. The battle was a chaotic, terrifying whirlwind of sound and fury, a brutal dance of death that was playing out on the quiet, dusty plains. Eliza, her heart pounding, her body trembling, was a quiet, powerful presence by Jake's side. She was not a woman who knew about guns, about war, but she was a woman who knew about survival, a woman who knew about love, a woman who was ready to fight for the people she loved. She handed him ammunition. She reloaded his gun. She was his quiet, unwavering support. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity. The ranch was a battlefield, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and the shouts of men. The house was riddled with bullet holes, the windows shattered, the furniture a mess of splintered wood and broken glass. It was a brutal, terrifying dance of death, a war that was being fought for a home, for a family, for a future. Suddenly a loud, clear voice, a voice that was both familiar and terrifying, echoed from the hills. "Jake," it shouted, "you can't win. You're outnumbered, you're outmatched. Just give up now, and I'll make this quick and easy." Jake looked at Eliza, his eyes filled with a raw, fierce determination. He had been a man who had faced down a storm and a drought, a man who had faced down a brutal enemy. He was not a man who was going to give up. He was a man who was going to fight for his home, for his family, for his love. "Never," he shouted back, his voice a low, furious growl. "This is our home, Carson. This is our family. We will never give up. We will never surrender." The battle continued, a fierce, unyielding dance of death. But now, it was a battle that was filled with a new kind of purpose, a battle that was not just about survival, but about a love that was stronger than any battle, a love that was a testament to the power of a shared purpose, a shared future, a shared life. The sun was setting, a fiery, angry disk in the sky, and the world was holding its breath, waiting for the final, most brutal chapter of the story to unfold. The battle raged into the night, the darkness illuminated by the constant flash of gunfire and the angry glow of a moon that was a cold, indifferent witness to the chaos. The ranch was a war zone, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and the shouts of men. The men on the ranch, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a fierce, desperate courage. They were fighting for their home, for their way of life, for the woman who had brought so much light and so much hope into their world. Eliza and Jake, a quiet, powerful force, were a constant presence in the heart of the battle. They moved through the house, their movements a synchronized, wordless dance, their love a powerful, unwavering shield against the storm of violence. She would hand him a loaded rifle. He would fire. She would hand him another. They were a team, a quiet, determined force, a testament to a love that was a powerful, unbreakable bond. The battle was a stalemate. The men on the ranch were holding their own, their courage and their knowledge of the land a powerful advantage. But Carson and his men were a relentless, unyielding force, and they were not going to give up. They were going to fight until the last man was standing, until the last bullet was fired. "Jake!" a voice shouted from the darkness, a voice that was filled with a cold, cruel fury. "You can't win! You're going to die here! You're all going to die here!" Jake didn't reply. He simply kept fighting. his face a grim mask of determination. He had been a man who had been running from his grief, but he was no longer running. He was fighting. He was fighting for his love, for his family, for his home. Suddenly, a new sound, a sound that was both familiar and terrifying, echoed from the hills. The sound of hooves, a rhythmic, powerful beat that was growing louder with each passing second. It was not the sound of Carson's men. It was the sound of a new army, a powerful, determined force that was coming to their aid. The men on the ranch, hearing the sound, looked at each other, a flicker of hope in their eyes. The men from the neighboring ranches, the men who had heard of the battle, the men who had come to their aid, were coming. They were coming to fight for a man who had been a quiet, unassuming force for good, a man who had been a symbol of hope and resilience in a world that was filled with despair. The new army, a powerful, determined force, rode into the battle, their rifles and shotguns a loud, angry roar. They were a powerful, overwhelming force, and they were not going to give up. They were going to fight until the last man was standing, until the last bullet was fired. Carson and his men, seeing the new army, were filled with a cold, hard dread. They had been so sure of their victory, so sure of their power, but now they were outnumbered, they were outmatched, they were outgunned. They were a defeated army, a force that was about to be broken. The battle raged for a few more minutes, a fierce, unyielding dance of death, then a final, victorious sound. A man's scream, a man's cry of pain, a man's final breath. The battle was over. The war was won. Jake stood there, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The ranch was a mess, the house a wreck, the fields a battlefield. But they had won. They had won. The men from the other ranches came forward, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and a profound respect. They had come to fight for a man who was now a symbol of hope and resilience in a world that was filled with despair. Jake looked at Eliza, his eyes filled with a raw, powerful emotion. He had been a man who had faced down a storm and a drought, a man who had faced down a brutal enemy, but he was more tired, more exhausted, more overwhelmed than he had ever been in his life. He was a man who had fought for his home, for his family, for his love. He was a man who had won. He was a man who was finally, truly home. The morning after the battle, the ranch was a scene of quiet, somber activity. The men, their faces grimed with dirt and sweat, worked tirelessly, cleaning up the mess of the battle. The air was filled with the scent of smoke and dust, and the silence was a heavy, profound presence. The war was over, but the scars remained, a constant, painful reminder of the price they had paid for their peace. Jake and Eliza were on the porch of the main house, their bodies a small, still fortress against the coming day. They were tired, exhausted, and overwhelmed, but they were also filled with a profound sense of gratitude, a profound sense of love. They had won. They had won. They had been a man and a woman who had been alone for so long, who had been running from their past, who had been burdened by their grief, but they had found each other, and they had found a love that was a powerful, unwavering force, a love that was a testament to the power of a shared purpose, a shared future, a shared life. They were a family now, a new kind of family, a family that had been forged in the crucible of a shared struggle, a shared grief, a shared hope. A horse-drawn wagon came down the road, and in it sat Silas and Lily. The little girl jumped down from the wagon, her face a mixture of fear and relief. She ran to her father, her small body trembling. Jake knelt down and took her in his arms, holding her close, her small body a quiet, reassuring presence against his. He was a man who had fought a war, a man who had faced down death, a man who had won. But in that moment, in that quiet, powerful embrace, he was just a father, a man who was home, a man who was safe. Lily then ran to Eliza and hugged her tightly. "You're home," she said, her voice a quiet, happy whisper. "You're home." Eliza's heart swelled. She had come to the ranch to survive, but she had found so much more. She had found a daughter, a family, a home. She had found a love that was more powerful than any battle, a love that was a testament to the power of a shared purpose, a shared future, a shared life. Later that afternoon, after the men had finished cleaning up the ranch, they all gathered around the well, a quiet, somber crowd. The well, now a symbol of their victory, was a powerful, unwavering presence. The sun was setting, a fiery, angry disk in the sky, and the world was filled with a quiet, profound peace. Jake, his voice a low, rough whisper, spoke to the men. "We won," he said. "We won, but we didn't win because of me. We won because of all of you. We won because of her." He looked at Eliza, a deep, profound love in his eyes. "She's not just a baker. She's a part of this ranch. She's a part of this family. She's a part of all of us." The men cheered, their voices a joyous chorus. They were happy for him, happy for her, happy for the new beginning. They were a family now, a new kind of family, a family that had been forged in the crucible of a shared struggle, a shared grief, a shared hope. That night, as the ranch was bathed in the soft glow of a full moon, Eliza and Jake sat together on the porch, their hands clasped. The house was quiet, the ranch was peaceful, and the world was a still, quiet presence around them. They had a future now, a future that was filled with a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. They had a love that was a powerful, unwavering force, a love that was a testament to the power of a shared purpose, a shared future, a shared life. Eliza looked at the ring on her finger, the small, beautifully carved heart, a quiet, powerful symbol of his love. She had come to the ranch to bake bread, to earn a living, to survive, but she had found so much more. She had found a man who had given her a ring, a home, a family. She had found a love that was a powerful, unwavering force, a love that was a testament to the power of a shared purpose, a shared future, a shared life. She was home.